And also At-Tirmidhi and Al-Hakim narrate that Aisha narrates the Prophet ﷺ said, "O Uthman, perhaps Allah will clothe you with a garment." What does that mean, clothe you with a garment? Meaning the Khilafah. Will make you the Khalifa. So if the hypocrites want you to remove it, do not remove it until you meet me. What does this mean? The Prophet ﷺ is calling them hypocrites. And he's telling him not to remove it, meaning you're upon the truth and that you don't have to remove the Khilafah, don't resign. So then anyone who says that Uthman should have resigned is mistaken. The Prophet ﷺ is telling him that those who call them to resign from the Khilafah, that they're hypocrites and that he should not remove it. And the Prophet ﷺ himself put him in charge of Medina when he went out to that Riqa'. And when he went out to Ghatafan, he puts Uthman radiallahu anhu in charge of Medina, which shows that the Prophet ﷺ accepted him in leadership positions. And just to understand more of what type of person Uthman radiallahu anhu was, we'll look at some of his sayings and his taqwa. Hani, his freed slave, his mawla, which is a freed slave, would say that whenever Uthman stood at a grave, he wept until his beard became wet. They used to tell him, you don't weep when there is talk about heaven and the hellfire, you don't weep like this. But how is it that you start weeping at the sight of a grave? And Uthman used to reply, I have heard from the Prophet ﷺ, the first obstacle of the last day, meaning the first station on the Day of Judgment, is the grave. If this step is easily overtaken, every other step will be easier. And if one found any difficulty at this stage, every other stage will be difficult on him. This is Uthman radiallahu anhu. And he says, he says about himself, if I were between paradise and hellfire, not knowing to which one I would be commanded, I would choose to be made into ash before coming to know which of them I would be ordered. This shows his taqwa. One time, he had pinched the earlobe of one of his slaves. He just pinched him on his ear a little bit. He didn't like that, the fact that he did that to him. He felt it was unjust of him. So he tells him, pinch me back. So the servant refused. He doesn't want to pinch the Khalifa back. So Uthman insists, tells him to pinch me back. And then the servant starts to pinch him lightly in his ear. And Uthman tells him, pinch me more painfully. For retaliation in this world is bearable, while I have no endurance for punishment on the day of resurrection. And this shows what type of person he was. And the type of person who did not accept for himself to be unjust or to do injustice to other people. Amr ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas heard Uthman saying, what prevents me from narrating the hadith is my fear that I may not be the most heedful. I have heard the Prophet ﷺ saying, whoever fabricates any speech and attributes it to me, let him have his seat in the hellfire. Let him await his seat in the hellfire. And for this reason he used to not narrate many ahadith. But in total he did narrate 146 ahadith about the Prophet ﷺ. And this is, of course, if you compare it to other narrators of hadith, it's a small number. And of his wisdoms, he used to say that there are 8 people who he's surprised at. I am surprised at a person who knows the world to be transient, temporary, yet he loves it. The person who knows death to be certain, and yet he doesn't take it seriously. And a person who believes in the hellfire, and yet he commits sin. And a person who believes in the existence of Allah, and yet he seeks assistance from others besides Allah. And a person who is aware of paradise, and yet he is engaged in the worldly pleasures. And a person who knows that shaitan is his enemy, and yet he obeys what he dictates. And a person who believes in predestination and the divine decree of Allah, yet feels aggrieved when something happens to him. And he used to say that he is also surprised at a person who knows that the account will be rendered on the day of resurrection, and yet he hoards wealth. The companions of the Prophet ﷺ also used to say about him. Ali radiallahu anh used to say about him, among other things, he used to describe Uthman as the most fearful of Allah. And Abdullah Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma used to say during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, we used to let the people choose between Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman. These are the companions now. And the people would choose Abu Bakr, Umar and then Uthman. So this was the order of excellence that the companions considered. Abu Bakr and Umar and then Uthman. And when he was elected Khalifa, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, we have elected the best of those who are still alive, and we did not betray. And Abdullah ibn Umar said, 3 men of Quraysh are the most handsome, and the noblest of character and the shyest. If they tell you anything, they will tell you only the truth. And if you speak to them, they will not lie to you. Those are Abu Bakr, Uthman Ibn Affan, and Abu Ubaidah Ibn Jarrah. And Abdurrahman Ibn Hatib used to say, I have not seen amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ more complete or better in speech than Uthman, except that he was a man who feared to relate hadith. And we explained why he used to fear to relate the hadith. And Muhammad ibn Sirin used to say, he was the most knowledgeable of the rituals of Hajj, followed by Ibn Umar. He was one of the most knowledgeable of the people. We'll move now to the election of Uthman radiallahu anhu after Umar, the second Khalifa, was stabbed. The bay'ah was given to him 3 days after the death of Umar radiallahu anhu. And Umar, when he was stabbed, he chose the 6 men, and there came to be known as the 6 men of Shura. The Khalifa should be chosen amongst these 6 men. And he includes to them his son Abdullah ibn Umar, but he stipulates that Abdullah ibn Umar can't become the Khalifa. And these 6 men were Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, and Talha ibn Ubaidullah. But Talha at this point was away. He was traveling and he was not there. And Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Uthman ibn Affan, and Zubair ibn al-Awwam. Notice that these 6, all of them are from the 10 given glad tidings of paradise. And they are also of the people that the Prophet ﷺ was pleased with in his farewell khutbah. And this was 14 or 15 years ago, and Umar radiallahu anhu still remembers. These are the people the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that he was pleased with in his farewell khutbah. So during the 3 days that they're deciding on who is the next Khalifa, they have to appoint someone, of course, to lead the Salah. And who does Umar radiallahu anhu choose? He chooses Suhaib al-Rumi. Suhaib al-Rumi, of course, means European, not necessarily just Roman. So he chooses a European man to lead the Salah. Why is that? What's the wisdom behind that? For this man to lead the Salah for 3 days? He was a non-Arab. This is the wisdom, that he would not cause any kind of strife, or people say, why did he choose him, and so on. He chose a man who was European. So then Abdurrahman ibn Auf volunteers to withdraw. He says, I don't want the Khilafah, I'm going to withdraw. Then he looks at Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, who is his cousin, and he asks him, would you like to withdraw? And then Sa'ad says yes. And then, of course, Abdullah ibn Umar himself wasn't allowed. They said they can't choose him as the Khalifa. So then the ones left were Uthman and Ali and Zubair. So then Abdurrahman ibn Auf tells him, would you be satisfied if I choose for you? And they said yes. So then Abdurrahman ibn Auf goes to Uthman in private, just the two of them. And he asks him, if I don't pledge to you, meaning if we were not to choose you, who would you suggest? And then Uthman says Ali. Then he goes to Ali and tells him, if we don't pledge to you, who would you suggest? And then Ali says Uthman. And this is against those people who say that Ali wanted the Khilafah and he was upset and so on. The Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ did not fight over worldly, wanting to be the Amir and so on. So then he goes to Zubair ibn al-Awwam and he tells him, if we don't pledge to, who would you pledge to? And he says, Ali or Uthman. And he said one of those two. Or perhaps he mentioned both of them as well. Then he goes to Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas and he says, as you and I are not interested in it, who would you pledge to? And Sa'ad says Uthman. And then, so now most of the people want Uthman radiallahu anhu. Of the 6 of Shura, they want Uthman. And then he asked, so those 6 want Uthman, but he asked the rest of Medina. And he used to go to people, knock on people's doors and ask everyone if they're generally pleased with Uthman being the Khalifa. And everyone was pleased with Uthman being the Khalifa. Abdurrahman ibn Auf says, for these 3 days, he says, by Allah, I have not slept. He's just going around, he's doing his job to the best of his ability. Didn't sleep for 3 days, asking people, knocking on people's doors, making sure they're okay with this Khalifa. Then the people pledged to Uthman radiallahu anhu at the masjid, and so does Ali and everyone else. And it was out of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon His ummah that after the difficulty of losing the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah chose for them a lenient and a gentle Khalifa as Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And after the death of Abu Bakr, a stern and strict Khalifa comes. And after the death of that strict Khalifa, Allah decrees that another Khalifa who is gentle with the Muslims will be put in charge. And this good treatment of this gentle Khalifa Uthman radiallahu anhu is what gave the opportunity for the fitna to spread. Now let's look at some of the achievements of Uthman radiallahu anhu. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu ruled for 2 years. And Umar radiallahu anhu ruled for 10 years. And the length of the Khilafah of Uthman was equal to both of that of Abu Bakr and Umar put together. Uthman radiallahu anhu was the Khalifa for 12 years. And it's really unfair to not mention the first 10 years, because the problems only occurred in the last 2 years of his Khilafah. And most books only focus on these 2 years. And it's not fair to not mention all of the good that happened in these 10 years and only focus on the 2 years of fitna. And as we said, he's part of the rightly guided Khilafah. And if he were not a good ruler, he would not be part of the rightly guided Khilafah. Of the territories that were added to Islamic lands, conquest continued during the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And the Muslim lands extended from Tripoli, which is Libya, to Algeria, as far west as Algeria. And the Muslims entered the lands of Cyprus, and they went into eastern Turkey, and they went into Armenia, north of Dagestan, or in English called Dagestan, which is a region of southeast Russia, bordering on the Caspian Sea. And they also entered the area of Sindh, which is a region of southern Pakistan along the lower Indus River. And then they also conquered Ray. When we hear Ray, this is actually what is Tehran right now, Tehran in Iran, which used to be under Persian territory. And another important thing that happened during his reign is that there was no such thing as the Persian Empire anymore. He took care of the Persian Empire, destroyed it. And there were two superpowers in the world at the time, and before the Muslims. There was Persia and there were the Romans. And during the reign of Uthman radiallahu anhu, there was no such thing as Persia anymore. Destroyed the Persian Empire. And they sent the Romans out of Egypt, and they sent them out of Palestine. And there was much abundance of good during his time. Muhammad ibn Sirin says, wealth increased during the rule of Uthman. A slave girl could be sold for her weight in money, and a horse for 100,000 dirhams, and a palm tree for 1,000 dirhams. And Hassan ibn Ali radiallahu anhu says, the provisions were abundant during the Khilafah of Uthman. And as the Khalifa, he used to lead the believers in Hajj 10 years in a row. We said he was the Khalifa for 12 years. 1 year was known as Amul Ri'af, which is people were stricken with nosebleeds. And Uthman radiallahu anhu also had this bleeding from the nose. So he couldn't go to Hajj that year. And the other year that he didn't go was when he was besieged in the same year that he was killed. He was besieged in his home and he couldn't go out to Hajj. And one of the other things that he did during his reign is he also expanded the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the second expansion. And he built it with stones this time. And he put stone pillars in it, and he made a firm roof, not just branches of date palms and so on. And he made its length 160 yards and its width 150 yards. And the conquests that took part during his reign were fought on land and on the sea. This is for the first time that the Muslims go into battle using ships and go into the battle on sea. And jihad continued for the 10 years of his 12-year reign, because of course in the last 2 years jihad halted because of the fitna. If you contemplate, you see how the fitan slow everything down and they take away the good from the ummah. And we would like to look at just quickly some events that took place during his reign. In the year 26 after the Hijrah, he expanded the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. And in the year 27 after the Hijrah, Mawviya radiallahu anhu conquered Cyprus. And with him was Ubad ibn Samit, and the wife of Ubad ibn Samit, who was known as Haram bint Malhan from the Ansar. She had fallen off her riding animal and she was buried there, just as the Prophet ﷺ had made dua for her. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned this army entering this area of Cyprus, and she asked the Prophet ﷺ to make dua for her, that she's amongst them. And he made dua for her, and she went there and she died and she was buried in Cyprus. And in the 28th or 29th year, he expanded the masjid in Medina, and he built it, as we said, with stone this time. And in the 30th year after the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ used to have a ring with which he would seal the letters and the orders. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he died, he gave it to Aisha radiallahu anha. And then when the new Khalifa is chosen, Abu Bakr, she gives it to him. And then he seals all his letters and things with it. And when he dies, Umar uses it, takes it over. And then when he dies, he gives it to Hafsa to hold on to it until a new Khalifa is chosen. So then it's given to Uthman, and then in that same year, it fell into a well, the well at Quba. And Uthman radiallahu anh could not find it, and it saddened him very much to lose the ring of the Prophet ﷺ, and he eventually had one that was similar to it made. And in the 31st year after the Hijrah, we see the death of Abu Sufyaan, Sakhr ibn Harb, who used to be one of the main enemies of Islam. He becomes a Muslim and he dies in the 31st year after the Hijrah. And we also see the death of Al-Hakam ibn Abi al-As. If you remember him, the uncle of Uthman who used to torture him. He becomes a Muslim and he passes away now. So what's happening now? Now the Sahaba, they're starting to die off. Becoming more and more like precious gems. Because at this time now you understand many reverts, many converts, many different people from all different lands of the Muslims. And then many of the Arabs becoming Muslim who never met the Prophet ﷺ, so they're not Sahaba. And now the Sahaba, as time passes, the further we move from the date of the Hijrah, Sahaba are passing away and they're becoming more and more precious to have a Sahabi amongst you. So they become like gems. These are the people who saw the Prophet ﷺ and defended him and learned from him. So they were precious and they were respected by everyone. And just incidentally, the scholars say that there are about 120,000 Sahaba. But nonetheless, some of them had certain merits, like being of the people of Badr and people who joined in all the battles and being the early Muslims. And these people were extremely valuable. And in the 32nd year after the Hijrah, we see the passing away of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf, one of the 10 given glad tidings of paradise. And then Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, an ocean of knowledge, a scholar amongst the companions, and one of the earliest of Muslims, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, passes away. And then Abu Darda al-Khuza'i, the pious and the wise man. And he was a judge of Damascus or of Damascus for the longest time under Muawiyah. And we see the passing away of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari and Zayd ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. Zayd ibn Abdullah. And what would make us know who is Zayd ibn Abdullah? Few people remember this name. He is the man who saw the adhan in the vision. Remember the story of the adhan when Umar came to mention it? A man had already seen it in a vision. Zayd ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu was the man who saw the adhan in his vision radiallahu anhu. So now the Sahaba are becoming rare and they're becoming, by the day, something that's more and more rare. And in the 33rd year after the Hijrah, we see Al-Miqdad ibn al-Aswad passing away. And in the 34th year after the Hijrah, the Fitna begins. And it ends in the 35th year after the Hijrah with the murder of Uthman radiallahu anhu. So we see that during his time there were many great battles and they conquered a lot of lands. And all the details of these battles are available. The details of the first battle Muslims ever had on the sea with their ships, they were victorious. Even though it was their first battle, they were victorious. All these details are there. And we see the heroics of the Muslims at these times. But we'll suffice with just mentioning the gist of what happened during his Khilafah radiallahu anhu. And of his other virtues are that he was the first to migrate in the way of Allah. When he migrated to Abyssinia with the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, Ruqayya, the Prophet ﷺ said that Uthman is the first to migrate in the way of Allah after the Prophet Lut. And he was the first to provide meals for all of those who fasted during Ramadan. And this is something we still do in the masajid. We provide meals for people who fast. Uthman radiallahu anhu was the first one to start this. And he was the first one to issue a salary for the mu'adhin, the people who make the adhan. He issued them a salary. And he was the first one to establish a police force. And he was the first person to gather a people upon one harf or one Quran. And this is the Quran we have today. When we open it on a certain page, they're all on the same ayah or the same surah. This is the harf of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And he made copies and distributed this to the major cities in the Muslim Empire. And he was the first one to ban the flying of pigeons for wagers. People would bet against each other and then they would fly and race their pigeons. And he banned that officially. And he was the first in whose reign there was construction of naval fleets and there was naval warfare during his reign. He also ruled longest of all the four rightly guided khulafa, and he was also the richest amongst them, and he was the one who compiled the Quran. This was a description of Uthman radiallahu anhu and his life and his achievements, and we wanted to get to know his character and his personality so that when we discuss the fitna and the accusations leveled against him, we can make a judgment of whether or not they were befitting or even possible. So now we'll move on to the beginning of the fitna and the murder of Uthman radiallahu anhu.